Hey everybody, so before we start, I just wanted to say we are once again within spitting distance of 100k. So if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing so we can push to 100k. When it comes to the God of War series, I feel like the main villains of the two main arcs, Zeus and Odin, create an interesting contrast that are almost analogous to the eras of the franchise that they represent. One is brash, bombastic, and over the top, whereas the other is subtle, more subdued, with a greater emphasis on substance over style. I've often said that these two eras of God of War are basically incomparable because they are so different, and whichever one you think is better is entirely down to personal preference. Well, screw that. This is the internet, the place where nuance goes to die. So I've decided to pit Zeus and Odin against each other in a completely 100% objective comparison that will once and for all determine who was the better antagonist. We're going to be comparing these characters based on 9 separate points: introduction, design, theme music, connection to Kratos, personality, menace/power, motivation, on-screen utilization, and finally, the boss fight. Making this a best of 9 series, so there has to be a winner determined by the end of this. So let's start, as any good story starts at the start. A key part of a great villain is the introduction, because how better to leave an impression by immediately making a mark? The bank heist scene in The Dark Knight, the opening scene in Star Wars: A New Hope, the interrogation of Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Those are just a few examples of instant and iconic villain introductions. As far as the introductions to Zeus and Odin in their respective antagonistic roles, I'd say they both have really good intros. While Zeus was briefly in the first game and also made a few short cameos in other games, I'm counting his introduction in God of War 2 as the proper introduction because that's where he was introduced as the villain. That's the sticking point here. He's not being introduced as a face in the wall that helps you, he's being introduced as a villain. And it's such a nut punch of a twist. You're going through the entire intro of God of War 2 under the assumption that the Colossus of Rhodes is being controlled by Athena and Zeus is lending you the Blade of Olympus to help deal with it, but in actuality he's tricking you into putting all your godly powers into the sword in order to swoop in, literally, and take you out at your most vulnerable. That's the most interesting thing about Zeus's intro, is that he straight up kills Kratos stone dead, and had Kratos not been the type of Greek hero to be too angry to die, Zeus would have won right there. Meanwhile, the introduction of Odin is much more subtle and arguably unceremonious. He shows up at Kratos' doorstep wanting to broker a peace deal so he can continue to oppress the 9 realms without the biggest threat to his power nipping at his heels. It's a great scene as far as dialogue and personality is concerned, as it's two very effective characters essentially playing psychological chess with each other, trying to figure each other out and not giving the other an inch. Then when Kratos refuses to play ball, Odin sicks Thor on him like a rabid dog, which does help his case for the fact that he has so much power and influence he doesn't even need to sully his hands, and the fight with Thor caps off one of my favorite intros to any game ever. But you can only give so many points to Odin when you're fighting his lackey, so I was going to give this point to Zeus because it is such an effective intro, but his intro has one glaring issue. It's the fact that his villainous introduction is extremely contrived. Not the heel turn. God no, it made perfect sense for Zeus to turn on Kratos, especially with the benefit of hindsight. What I mean is, he gave Kratos the Blade of Olympus and tricked him into putting all his power into it, but the problem is he didn't seem to have any clear idea of what to do next. It just so happened that fortune fell into his lap when the Colossus of Rhodes fell on Kratos, almost killing him. If that didn't happen, then what was Zeus's plan, especially since he just gave Kratos ultimate power? Was he gonna sneak up from behind him and slit his throat? There's no way to know. I want nothing more than to be able to give this point to Zeus, but fair is fair. His villainous introduction has one glaring flaw, whereas Odin's introduction is basically perfect for what it is, even if it doesn't hit the same highs as far as what they're setting out to do. So in the issue of impartiality, I give the point to Odin. The God of War series has a number of iconic music tracks, though I wouldn't necessarily say that either Odin's theme or Zeus's theme would be the first ones you'd think of when looking at iconic music tracks. I had to listen to both of them to reacquaint myself with the themes, and after doing so, I can safely say that they both basically go for the same thing. They're both epic orchestral music tracks with a choir singing in the background. They're both good tracks when you get down to it, and they both definitely fit the tone of what's happening. Zeus's theme is aggressive and epic, but it's also a touch repetitive by the end. Whereas Odin's theme is less epic, but it also has more musical variety as well as a fantastic build-up and payoff. This is definitely gonna be the most subjective point on the list, but what it comes down to for me is which of these tracks I would want to listen to more in my spare time. If I'm being entirely honest, I would have to go with Zeus's theme. While it's slightly repetitive, it also has a recognizable hook and melody that honestly becomes a bit of an earworm after a while. It also has a more aggressive, powerful sound, which is exactly what you want with a villain theme. It's both the type of theme that works for the villain, but it's also something that I would put on my workout playlist, so the point goes to Zeus. When it comes to the interactions between an antagonist and a protagonist, it's always good to have some sort of connection between them. You want the characters to have a personal stake with each other, and for their confrontation and antagonism to be based on something personal. Otherwise, why should we care? Hence why most Spider-Man villains have some sort of personal history with Peter Parker. But it doesn't necessarily have to be just one thing. A personal connection can be parallel personalities, personal history, a family relationship, or some sort of shared experience. Obviously, Zeus immediately gains the upper hand for the fact that they have a personal connection in that Zeus is Kratos' father, plus Zeus is also personally responsible for essentially destroying Kratos' family. He put a curse on Kratos' mother that led to her death, and also was responsible for Kratos' brother being kidnapped and eventually killed. So there's a lot of personal connection and animosity between the two of them, and quite frankly, that personal connection and history between them is partially why their animosity is as compelling as it is. Especially because of Zeus attempting to stop the cycle of patricide, but for the record, Kronos is still alive and well until he's not. So it's not exactly a cycle as of right now. Meanwhile, Odin doesn't have the same personal connection with Kratos in that they're completely unrelated. However, Odin does attempt to be a thorn in Kratos' side from a familial perspective when he essentially uses Atreus' naivete and headstrong nature to become a surrogate dad to Atreus, which threatens to drive Kratos off the deep end. And there are some other personal connections, but a lot of them are more or less built on the personal connections with Zeus. The reason why Kratos sees right through Odin and doesn't give him the time of day is because he's dealt with so many people who have manipulated him over the years that he can smell it like a shark smelling blood in the water. And their personal connection can also be in some ways tied to Kratos' past in the sense that Odin attempts to poke at his insecurities over the things he did in his past. A lot of which can also be seen as projection, but no matter how you spin it, I feel that the personal connection that Kratos has with Zeus is too strong to deny. And while his contentiousness and antagonism with Odin is interesting, it's not built on previous history. In fact, it's more built on the back of Kratos being an outsider to these lands. So the point goes to Zeus. When it comes to a memorable villain, a memorable design is another one of the most important things to consider. Would Ridley Scott's Alien be so memorable if it didn't look so innately frightening? Would Halloween have lasted as long as it has if they didn't have that modified William Shatner mask? So an instantly recognizable design is what we're looking for here. Ideally, you'd want a character who's instantly identifiable by their silhouette alone, and I feel like that's the case for both these characters, so we have to get more into the minutiae of design sensibilities to really nail down who I think has the better design. Zeus has his white toga and golden gauntlets, pure white eyes, pure white hair, and a muscular frame. Meanwhile, Odin is practically the opposite of that, being a deceptively frail old man, bald with an eye patch, wearing an elegant blue tunic and earth-toned cape. When it comes to a character design, oftentimes less is more, but one could argue that Zeus is almost underdesigned. The gauntlets are a nice touch, but otherwise I don't find that there's much to make him stand out as God of War's version of Zeus instead of, just Zeus. It's a bit standard as far as interpretations of Zeus, is my point. Meanwhile, I find that Odin is much more appealing in his design. He's unique in that he's the complete opposite of what you'd expect, so it immediately makes him identifiable as God of War's version of Odin. Also, I think that his outfit is very appealing. It's elegant without being over-designed, the greens and the blues complement each other, as do the earth tones. Plus, I love that his design is informed by his personality and vice versa. He's attempting to be an unsuspecting person, and that's exactly what you get when looking at Odin. And to be fair, you do still get that extremely imposing and powerful look from Zeus, but I'd argue it's harder to make someone look unsuspecting but still be a good villain, while it's a bit easier to make someone walk the walk and talk the talk as far as being menacing. So ultimately, this might be a controversial opinion, but I think Odin squeaks out a victory in design. But once again, this is a deeply subjective point of comparison and is probably going to be down to personal preference. I just think that Odin is more interesting and they do more with his design. Unlike design, when it comes to a villain's personality, generally speaking, more is more. The best villains are truly the ones that you can relate to, who seem human and flawed, yet logical in their actions. Granted, it's also possible to make a good villain a pure force of nature, but in many cases, a force of nature villain is good by virtue of us liking the people they're fighting, or sometimes they're good for us wanting to see the people they're fighting against bite it. So with that said, this one's pretty much going to come down to personal preference. So with that said, this may ruffle some feathers, but I think that Zeus comes across as somewhat two-dimensional at times. He's brash, filled with rage, he demands obedience, and is very spiteful, but he can also come across as generically evil at times. Not helped by the revelation that his heel turn was partially as a result of corruption by Pandora's box. I'm not going to say he's a bad villain, he's absolutely an effective villain, but personality-wise, he's a bit two-dimensional at times. Meanwhile, they attempted to have a more deep villain with Odin. He's narcissistic, he's slimy, he's two-faced, he's abusive, he's paranoid, he's a master manipulator, doing everything he possibly can to get what he wants out of everyone at any given time. Whether that means telling Atreus everything he wants to hear, or abusing Thor to keep him in line. He demands obedience and control, but does it more through tyrannical oppression as opposed to pure power. And if he can't manipulate you, he tries to psychologically break you down and make you snap like he attempted to do to Kratos. Even when he's lying, he's so convincing and so charismatic that it can be hard to argue with the things he says. And it helps that he obviously buys into his own bullshit. And as a matter of fact, I don't remember where I read this, but I saw someone put it like this. He may look unsuspecting, but if you underestimate him, he's already won. Plus, he's also fiercely intelligent, as shown when he's revealed to have been Tyr the entire time in order to get the drop on Kratos and his crew. Meanwhile, Zeus is mostly just a brute, ruling through brute strength. Odin is a more subtle character, but has so many more things going for him that you can dissect and look at, so as far as pure personality, I think that Odin is the better one. So point to Odin. I was torn about what to call this category, or if I should have separated them off, because this is a discussion of how menacing the villain comes across, but then also how powerful the villain is. And I feel that because these two things are so intrinsically linked, you can't really separate them off. Part of a villain's appeal is their menace, the feeling of all hope being lost the moment they walk into a room. Their on-screen presence of pure power and captivating aura, and it's equally good if they can back it up. In that respect, this one isn't even a contest. As far as menace and raw power is concerned, Zeus takes it easily. He essentially requires you to use several ancient powers to defeat him, and at various points he destroys entire armies with naught but a wave of his hand. The dude casually destroyed Sparta just out of spite, and even if he didn't do these things, you could take one look at him and believe he could. But the comparison also isn't necessarily fair considering that Odin isn't supposed to be a menacing villain, he's supposed to be more unsuspecting. Like, you're supposed to be surprised that the ruler of the 9 realms is this wiry old dude that looks like Steve Buscemi with an eye patch. These things aren't true for Zeus. While I know that Odin is all-powerful, sight unseen you could be mistaken into thinking he's not. And really, what feats of power does he really show throughout his time on screen? He kills Thor, but Thor was also beaten down by Kratos. So he can't exactly say he earned that W, otherwise his feats of power come across as him being paranoid instead of powerful. Like having the ravens all over the 9 realms. In direct conflict, I'm more afraid of Thor than Odin based on how they carry themselves and how they display their power. And I think that in a direct one-on-one fight, he would get stomped by Zeus. Hell, I think that Zeus would probably steamroll Odin and Thor in a 2v1 handicap match, so this point easily goes to Zeus. The motivation. What makes the villain tick? What makes them go from point A to point B? Both Zeus and Odin have similar motivations in the sense that they want to remain in power over their domain against the people who threaten to overthrow their tyrannical rule. Zeus over the Greek domain and Odin over the Norse. And as a matter of fact, destiny also plays a big part in the reason for their conflict in the sense that both Zeus and Odin are essentially destined to be overthrown. In Zeus's case, it has to do with both a prophecy that determines a marked warrior bringing about the end of Olympus, as well as a thematic synchronicity of a son destroying their father. And in Odin's case, the ever-prophesized Ragnarok is his destined downfall, and therefore he does everything to prevent it. However, Odin also has a secondary motivation, which is a greater understanding. He seeks unlimited knowledge and the understanding of all the universe's secrets. To that end, he wants to unlock the secrets of the mysterious mask, as well as the mysterious rift that accompanies it. And through that, he manipulates Atreus by giving him everything he wants, so Atreus can help him to unlock the secrets. So Odin has multiple levels of motivation that actually makes all his actions and manipulations synchronous. So I believe that Odin already gets the point, but then you have to consider the fact that Zeus was once again also corrupted by the power of Pandora's box, which mostly serves to push the buck away from Kratos as far as blame for destroying Olympus. It's not bad by any means, but I do think that a villain who acts purely on their own volition based on their desires is usually automatically more compelling than a villain who's not fully in control of their own mental faculties. In this case, I think that's true, so for having a deeper motivation and for his motivation being entirely his own, this point goes to Odin. Personality and motivation are all well and good, but part of being a good villain is maximizing your moments, your dialogue, your actions, making every moment you're on screen memorable. And once again, this is a bit tough considering how different the screen time is for these two characters. Zeus spends most of these games in the shadows, commanding his armies and letting his lackeys do his job for him. Meanwhile, Odin has a much more personal stake in the story, and you see much more of him. But because Odin is used a lot more in the story, I do think that unfortunately leads to an inevitable handful of forgettable moments. I can pretty much recall every single moment that Zeus was on screen between God of War 2 and 3. And because they held off on having him appear for most of these games, it truly did feel like an event when he showed up. Meanwhile, we get so much of Odin that he can't help but not be as impactful at a moment-to-moment level. Zeus's actions hit, his dialogue hits, whenever he shows up, something important happens. So by making his moments count and never losing his status of feeling like a big deal, this one goes to Zeus. And now we come down to the final category with both villains having 4 points apiece. And the final category is the boss fight. Now, of course, when you have a villainous force in a video game, inevitably it leads to a boss fight. And here we have 2 final boss fights between 2 devastating forces at the end of God of War 3 and the end of God of War Ragnarok, respectively. God of War 3's final boss is split into several parts, both major and minor, to the point that you could say this is a 2-part fight or a 4-part fight, and both would be equally valid. First of all, taking place 2D style in the Chamber of Flame, then Part 2 gets interrupted by Gaia who shows up, Part 3 takes place inside Gaia, then Part 4 is an ethereal spirit journey, followed by you finally overcoming Zeus and beating him until you're literally blinded by rage, and once the screen clears, he's finally gone. Meanwhile, Odin's boss fight isn't quite as in-depth. After fighting your way through a lackluster rendition of the Battle of Ragnarok, you fight Thor, Odin kills Thor, then you have a brouhaha with Odin that lasts a disappointing and not particularly interesting 2 phases before Atreus seals his soul into one of the marbles. You could probably tell just by my description which one takes the point in this case. It's Zeus without a shadow of a doubt. His boss fight builds and builds and builds into an ultimate climax that feels like a properly satisfying payoff for an entire game's worth of conflict, and indeed an entire trilogy's worth of conflict. Plus, he also earned some bonus points by being the final boss in God of War 2 with a similarly well-built and executed ending, albeit not quite as good as the final boss in God of War 3. Meanwhile, the final boss with Odin just sort of happens, doesn't really feel like a worthy payoff. It could have used an extra phase or 2, and Odin should have gained the upper hand at some point. They didn't even really pay off the mechanics as presented, like for example, there maybe should have been a phase of the boss fight as Atreus. So yeah, I think as far as the final boss is concerned, Zeus is by far the better payoff for an entire game's worth of fighting. That means, with all 9 categories accounted for, the winner is Zeus, with 5 points to 4. With Odin taking points for introduction, design, personality, and motivation, but Zeus squeaks ahead with points for his connection to the protagonist, his theme, power/menace, on-screen utilization, and his boss fight. So looking at it, it seems that in this specific set of circumstances, Odin has the edge as far as story, whereas the qualities that put Zeus ahead are more scattershot, encompassing gameplay, presentation, and even a few aspects of the story. And I think that's what makes Zeus the winner in this case, if you ask me, is the fact that he's a more well-rounded villain compared to Odin, where they kind of put a lot of eggs into a few baskets. Alright, well I hope we've had some fun today, but I hope nobody's taking this too seriously, because there's an overarching point I wanted to make here. As fun as it is to compare and contrast things that these characters do, the amount of times I had to say that one character goes for a completely different thing compared to the other character is too damn many. And while it is fun to compare, I see it all too often, not just with this, but a lot of arbitrary comparisons where somebody will use something they like as a baton to beat something they don't like. The amount of times I've seen people try and use Zeus to absolutely disparage Odin as a character is ridiculous, because oh my god, he doesn't do X, Y, and Z, therefore he's not as good of a character as Zeus, therefore he's a bad character. Despite the fact that I do think Zeus takes the cake overall, that's not to say that Odin is a bad villain, much as I'm sure people would like me to say that. He's just a different type of villain, a more subtle villain, a more psychological villain. Zeus is like a sledgehammer who's unsophisticated but shockingly powerful and effective, while Odin is more of a scalpel, more precise, more subtle, but arguably just as effective. Or to make the absolute lamest analogy I could possibly make, Zeus is basically the Undertaker, whereas Odin is Bret the Hitman Hart. Which I guess in this analogy means that Kratos is Goldberg. Actually, that's almost scarily accurate considering that Goldberg almost killed both of them. But anyways, while Zeus may have gotten the rub in this case, it's worth mentioning that I think both these villains are good and effective for what they are, and I think this is something that a lot of people seem to forget, is that two things can be independently good without one having to be used against the other. I think it's immature and does damage to the discourse when things like this are taken far too seriously and are used as a basis of actual criticism. And honestly, if you ask me, while this is my list, I could easily see it going the other way to someone else. It's all personal perspective. But hey, that's just my opinion, I'll get off my soapbox now. If this video does well, I might actually do something similar, comparing and contrasting Ares and Balder, the battle of the first in their saga villains. But that's all I've got, so if you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support me in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards, such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Gaw004, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Ty Trovy, and Weird Webster for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.